to International House and welcome to CIEE. CIEE stands for Council. For those of you who do not know who we are, it is Council on International Educational Exchange. My name is Kwesi Jesse Jamra, and I serve as the director for the program here at the University of Ghana. You are here because of this afternoon's lecture, which is a way that CIEE is celebrating Black History Month, which is the month of February, that is going on all over in the country and all over around the world. For those who do not know, this year marks the 400th year that the first slaves were moved from Ghana across the Atlantic to the Americas. And so this is marking the year of return for Ghana, and we are celebrating a lot of activities going on between now to the end of the year. It has the presidential support, it has the Ministry of Tourism's support, it has the African American Association of Ghana's support, and so I do know that the current vice president is coordinating a number of activities that are going to take place at the W.E.B. Du Bois Center. I know that the National Theatre of Ghana is also staging the play, a dance performance titled Araminta, on Harriet Tubman, who is believed to be originally from Ghana. So this afternoon's talk by Senior Research Fellow of the Institute of African Studies, Dr. Obadele Kambon, is on the Africans who emancipated themselves. And it's going to throw a lot of light on the black race, the peoples of the continent, and also connected to and also in the diaspora, and connected to what is happening in today's world. I say that the blacks who emancipated themselves, Ghana, if you look at Ghana specifically, you are seeing all these women who sell by the roadsides, who would not have formal employment because of their educational background, but they have not made unemployment stop them from finding something to do. They have been entrepreneurial, and therefore it is a way of blacks emancipating themselves. So in the face of nothing, something is churned out. And this is manifested in a lot of things that countries on the continent in the diaspora are doing. And here at CIEE, we are using this lecture as an opening for our students and the university community and the invited persons to start some discussions around this very, very important topic. So Doc, thank you very much. And audience, thank you very much. Welcome.
I was asking Kwesi if I should do the lecture in Chi or in English. He said, please do it in English. So. All right, so anytime I give a talk, I always like for it to be as interactive as possible. So when I say emancipation, I want you to say free black nation. Can we try that? Emancipation? Free black nation. Now because black and African are synonyms, the next time I say it, I want you to say free African nation. So we'll try that. First time, emancipation, free black nation. Next time, emancipation, you say free African nation. Are you ready? Emancipation? Free black nation. Emancipation? Free African nation. Emancipation? Free black nation. Emancipation? Free African nation. Very good. And as mentioned by my honorable senior colleague, Kwesi Jesse Jamra, I will be speaking on the Africans who emancipated themselves. Now, originally I gave this lecture at Emancipation Day. It was the opening of a restaurant called Jamrock, right? And one thing I found is everyone had this idea that, Abraham Lincoln freed the Africans who were enslaved, or this white man or that white man. And I said, it seems like we don't know very much about the Africans who emancipated themselves. And we'll go a little bit into that today. And what you see here is an image of some Africans who are emancipating themselves, right? Emancipation? Free black nation. Emancipation? Free African nation. Free African nation for the second one. Now, first off, I want us to, so my background is in linguistics, so I want us to go a little bit into this term that we hear applied so often to us as African people, which is the term slave. Now, I want us to look a little bit at the etymology of that word and see if perhaps we qualify or we don't. So, late 13th century, person who is a chattel or property of another, from Old French esclave, from medieval Latin sclavos, slave, also Italian schiavo, French esclave, Spanish esclavo, originally Slav. So Slav, if you ever hear of Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, the Slavic people, right? So this is a term that's actually applying to Eastern so-called Europeans, right? Now, what then happens is that term is now applied to us as African people. Emancipation?
Free African nation.
Emancipation?
Free African nation.
Very good. So this since development arose in the consequence of the wars waged by Otto the Great and his successors against the Slavs, a great number of whom they took captive and sold into slavery or slavery, as we would say it. So the etymology, again, it goes into the same thing. So this is from Middle English, borrowing from the Old French esclave, medieval Latin sclavus, so forth and so on. But again, what we see is a term originally applied to non-Africans, the Slavic people, that's now being applied to us as black people. So we should be very cognizant and careful of how much do we want to identify with Slavic people, because that's not us, nor is that our natural state. So if they apply that term to us, they're saying that we've temporarily been put into a position similar to Slavic people, right? But of course, that's not our natural state as African people by any ways or means. So on Emancipation Day, this is celebrated in various former British colonies and neo-colonies in the Caribbean and areas of the United States on various dates of observance of emancipation.
Free Black nation.
See, I'm going to see if you're paying attention, because this word will come up. Of enslaved Africans, black people, widely observed in British West Indies during the first week of August, in many Caribbean countries as part of Carnival, but Trinidad and Tobago takes place February or March according to Ash Wednesday and beginning of Lent, not near August, but in most places it's near August thereabout. Emancipation?
Free Black nation.
Emancipation?
Free Black nation.
Emancipation?
Free Black nation.
Emancipation?
Free African nation.
Very good. So oftentimes when we think about this, we think about the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833, where Britain abolished chattel enslavement, at least in the form that we know it. So the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833, citation 3 and 4, this is what ended slavery in the British Empire, August 28, 1834, with exceptions of the territories in the possession of the East India Company, the island of Ceylon, and the island of St. Helena. Exceptions were eliminated in 1843. But let's look at this date, because I want us to look at what African people did on the run-up to that in order to force the hand of the British. Emancipation?
Free Black nation.
Emancipation?
Free African nation.
Very good. Now, not too long ago, a movie came out called Belle, and what it did, it documented the Somerset case. And what this was in 1772, you had Lord Mansfield's judgment, the Somerset case, emancipated an enslaved person in England. This was related, of course, to the movement to abolish enslavement. The case ruled that slavery is unsupported by law in England, and from there, they said no authority can be exercised on enslaved entering English or Scottish soil, right? Now, oftentimes we'll hear names like Wilberforce, like Lincoln, as these great benefactors who they heard the violin strings, and then they said, oh, you're tugging at my heartstrings, let's do well to these enslaved black people. But we'll look at a little bit of background information to say that that was not necessarily the case. But in terms of what they call the anti-slavery movement, by 1783, an anti-slavery movement to abolish enslavement throughout the empire among the British public, we saw that taking root. By 1793, Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada, John Graves Simcoe, signed an act against slavery, passed by a local legislative assembly. And this was the first legislation to outlaw the Mahakwa or Bangladeshi in part of the British Empire. But we'll see that African people had abolished enslavement long before that in places like Palenque, in places like Quilombo, and these are free African nations in the Western Hemisphere. You had also the Slave Trade Act in 1807. I want us to also look at what led to this act itself. In 1808, Parliament passed the Slave Trade Act of 1807. This outlawed the slave trade, but not slavery itself, and we'll go into why that slight nuance took place. Because, of course, we're dealing with emancipation.
Free black nation.
One person is awake, everyone else is asleep. Emancipation!
Free black nation.
Emancipation!
Free African nation. Free black nation.
Emancipation!
Free African nation.
Very good. So the Royal Navy established the West Africa Squadron to suppress the Atlantic, and Toriasi Otuko and Chi. Toriasi is genocide, Otuko is forced migration, or also known as the Maafa in Kiswahili, which is a disaster. It's a word that expresses disaster, but this can also incorporate natural disasters as well. So another term has been proposed also in Kiswahili, Maangamizi, which is a disaster that is intentional, that someone decided to do a disaster against another people. So what they did is they patrolled the coast of West Africa. They suppressed it, however, it did not stop until emancipation.
Free black nation.
Emancipation?
Free black nation.
So we have to go into the question of why abolish chattel enslavement. Was it because of questions of morality, or was it because of questions of fear? And you can see this in the background as a depiction of what went on when the Africans emancipated themselves. All right. Now, I want us to look at a quick quote from the late ancestor, Nana Babi E. Wright. And it's worth quoting in full, so if you'll bear with me, because of course we're dealing with emancipation.
Free black nation.
We're dealing with emancipation.
Free black nation.
Emancipation?
Free black nation. Free black nation.
Good. And we're going from free black nation to free African nation. So behavioral scientists generally agree that the outstanding characteristics of the psychopathic personality are the almost complete absence of ethical or moral development and an almost total disregard for appropriate patterns of behavior. This characteristic has led to a misunderstanding of the psychopath as someone who does not know the difference between right and wrong. This belief is not true. Psychopaths simply ignore the concept of right and wrong. By ignoring this trait in the white race, the lack of ethical and moral development blacks have made and are still making a tragic mistake in basing the worldwide black liberation movement on moral suasion. It is pathological for blacks to keep attempting to use moral suasion on a people who have no morality where race is the variable.
Wow. Free black nation.
Emancipation?
Free black nation.
Emancipation?
Free African nation.
And this is brought up in various contexts where you have people, places like the US where they talk about global justice, right? And they talk about global justice and they have a Department of Justice, and the building of the Department of Justice is sitting on land that they stole from the indigenous people. So the very first act that they would have to do if they were about justice would be to get off of the land that they stole from someone, right? And meanwhile, we're in courts, and there's a quote from a group called United Front, where they say, they're talking about the situation of black people there. They say, treated like a thief on stolen land, the descendant of stolen woman and stolen man. I'll come again. Yes. Treated like a thief on stolen land, the descendant of stolen woman and stolen man. Let's just let that sink in. So again, we're going to deal a little bit with the restoration of Ma'at. For those who do not know, and I know we have quite a few who do know, Ma'at is usually translated with 7 concepts: truth, justice, order, balance, harmony, righteousness, and/or propriety, and reciprocity. Some people will say it's propriety, some say righteousness, but we'll look at that really quickly. So if we're going to talk about justice, this is the oldest concept of justice in the history of the entire planet Earth, and that concept of justice is written with a woman. It's a feminine principle of justice, right? And if anyone has ever run afoul of a black woman, you understand why. we would make that association. And again, truth, justice, righteousness, propriety, harmony, balance, order, reciprocity. And this is how it's written in the very first written language in the history of the planet Earth called Medu Neter. Right, so this is Ma'at. You see her in all her glorious blackness. Now, you've noticed that I'm holding a book. And usually when you see people holding the book, it's a Bible. But this time, it is not that. This one is dealing with emancipation.
Free black
It's dealing with emancipation?
Free African nation.
Emancipation?
Free black nation.
Emancipation.
Free African nation.
Emancipation.
Free black nations.
Emancipation?
Free black nation.
Very good. And this is Slaves Who Abolished Slavery, Blacks in Rebellion. Of course, in this particular lecture, I decided not to use the term slaves because we're not Slavic people. If anyone needs a mirror, I will show you, and maybe you can see that as black people, we are not Slavic, so we may not want to use that term. But this is one of the primary texts that you should go to if you're interested in this subject of how African people freed themselves. Going back quite some time, we'll look at some of those rebellions. And again, this is the image that you saw in the background in the forefront. So anytime, now, who here has ever heard of Napoleon Bonaparte? Napoleon, okay, a few. Who here has heard of Nana Jean-Jacques Dessalines? Okay, good, we have a good spread. Now, oftentimes when I speak somewhere, I'll have people who've heard of Napoleon, but they haven't heard of Dessalines. And Dessalines was the general who defeated Napoleon's army, right? So that would beg the question, how come we know the loser, but we don't know the winner? Right? When you look at their faces, it should become very clear, because we won the war, but apparently we're not winning the peace. But we'll come back to that subject. Now, we asked the question of morality or fear, and these are depictions of Dessalines from the whites who were very afraid, right? And when you read their own writings at the time, they weren't mentioning morality, they were mentioning, if we don't do something, Haiti will be everywhere. If we don't do something, Jamaica will be everywhere, right? And they didn't like that idea. Well, look here, this is the image of Boy Caiman, right? Which is a lagoon filled with crocodiles, a swamp area filled with crocodiles, that he made a prayer. And it was a very poignant speech where he said, throw away the image of the white man's God who has brought down our tears, and listen to the voice of liberty which speaks in all of our hearts. It's like he said it just yesterday, because if you walk around Ghana, what will you see on the back of every trotro but the white man's God? When they threw away that image, that's when they were able to have a successful rebellion. Ever since they've been under Catholicism, Haiti has been probably the most impoverished place on the planet, at least the Western Hemisphere, right? So we need to perhaps look at either correlation or causation, or at least we need to look at emancipation. Oh, you thought I wasn't coming back around to you. You can't sleep in my lecture. If you try to fall asleep, someone next will say, free black nation, and you'll wake up all of a sudden. And these are other images made by the whites, right? Now, you don't see images depicting morality here. What you see is fear, right? So you see, Incendie de la Plaine du Cap, and massacre des Blancs par les Noirs. So massacre of the whites by the blacks, right? Massacre, that's what they call it. Now, when they kill thousands of us, it's a victory. When we are fighting for truth, justice, righteousness, ma'at, they say that's a massacre. I think someone is running a game on us with this English language. And what you saw earlier on the first slide was, I'm going to make a correlation, and this is made by Imahu Jedi Shemsu Jehuti. You may also know him as Dr. Jacob Carruthers. And he focused his work on ancient Kemet, what some people may know as ancient Egypt, Kemet is the original name that the people themselves called that land. They didn't call it, oh, I'm in ancient Egypt. I'm enjoying myself here in ancient Egypt. They called their land Kemet, which means land of black people. And they called themselves Kemet-Yu, which means black people. And Imahu Jedi Shemsu Jehuti, Dr. Jacob Corrales, he focused his work, a lot of his work on Kemet and then also on Haiti. Because what he saw, the correlation is black people coming together on the basis of being black in order to fight their common non-African enemies, right? And you even see this in pulling the hair and then smiting. We see a very similar thing going on here in the Caribbean, right? So it becomes clear how he's able to make that link. But he wasn't the first to make that link. We mentioned Napoleon Bonaparte. He invaded Kemet, he invaded Haiti, and he said that what he is doing is not so much for economic concerns, so much as to stop the forward march of the black race in the world. Now this is Haiti, the pearl of the Antilles, the richest colony in the Western Hemisphere, richer than all 13 colonies put together. But he said he's not so much concerned about the economics of the thing, he's concerned about stopping the seed of revolution anywhere in the world. That was in a letter to Mitterrand, his foreign minister. Emancipation?
Free nation.
Emancipation.
Free nation.
And again, we see even more. Révolte générale des Nègres, massacre des Blancs. A general revolt of the Negroes, the blacks, and a massacre of the whites. So again, we don't see very much morality being depicted here, right? From their point of view. Now for some of us, this would be very moral and ethical to get justice, but from their point of view, they see it as a massacre, right? So our heroes tend to be their enemies, and their enemies tend to be our heroes, right? So when they're celebrating a George Washington, some of us as African people, we see that this is a rapist, an enslaver, an enemy to black people, right? And we can go down the list. Now, what was mentioned before was the 400 years, the year of return, right? So who can do the math? We're here in what they tell us is 2019. Who can do the math to go back 400 years? What date does that give us? Can anyone do the arithmetic? 2019 minus 400 equals 1619. And I went to an undergraduate school where they celebrated 1619 with what they called the Will Tupper Society. And this was the first black boy to be born in the colony of Jamestown, Virginia, right after the arrival of the parents there in 1619. Now, I want us to look at the first date here. Now, this is the very first, or one of the very first uprisings and revolutions recorded. The very oldest uprising in the diaspora was actually not in the Western Hemisphere. It was in the Eastern Hemisphere, and it's called the Zanj Rebellion against the Arab enslavers of black people. When you have names like Zanzibar, right? All that Zanj is because they saw East Africa as the natural place where they would take enslaved Africans. And those enslaved Africans rose up on the Arabian Peninsula and slew, and they even formed their own government there on the Arabian Peninsula in the Zanj Revolution. But here, if we look at the Western diaspora, we have something older than 1619. So what's going on here? This isn't when they first arrived, this is one of the first recorded revolts, right? Emancipation?
Free black nation.
Emancipation?
Free African nation.
So I think this goes beyond 1619, and perhaps we need to take a very good look at that. So this is 1526, San Miguel de Guadalajara in Spanish Florida, and this revolution was victorious. The African people won. Emancipation!
Free black nation.
Emancipation!
Free African nation.
Right? Also in 1570, you had Gaspar Yanga's revolt in Veracruz, New Spain, what we now call Mexico. And that one was also victorious. Emancipation?
Free black nation.
Emancipation?
Free African nation.
Now recently I looked at a documentary called For Humanity, and it was dealing with Colombia, the Palenque War. And this was ended on the 18th of July, 1605, again older than 1619. So perhaps someone has their math a bit mixed up. So the governor of Cartagena, Geronimo de Suazo y Casasola, unable to defeat the Maroons, offered a peace treaty to Bencos Viejo, right? An African who himself was a traditional ruler before he was enslaved, right? Now, a few years later, when he was walking through Cartagena, following the treaty as he was allowed to do, he was captured illegally by the governor. They hung him and then they quartered him. Quartered means that they rip you into 4 parts. They rip your body apart. I hope you're following.
Yeah.
Emancipation?
Free African nation.
Emancipation?
Free African nation.
However, Palenque, it still lives on, and that's what the documentary is about, the descendants of those Africans who established their own free republic. Now, this is a free republic before anywhere else, right? The African republics that we established for ourselves are the very first ones, and unfortunately, even places like the US are still not free of slavery. How many people are aware of that? Very good, we have an astute audience. We'll come back to that point. Also in 1712, the New York Slave Revolt. Of course, we don't like that term. This is what we get in the history books if you want to look it up. This is in the British province of New York. This one was suppressed. In 1730, the first Maroon War in British Jamaica, that one was victorious. You also had 1733, the St. John Slave Revolt. Danish St. John, that one was suppressed. The 1739 Stoner Rebellion, the British province of South Carolina, that one was also suppressed. And if you look at this, one of the end results of the suppression of the Stoner Rebellion was the banishment of the drum, because with the Stoner Rebellion, African people were using the talking drums to call each other together, right? So this is why you have to do ham bone and things to play, because from there they realized how important African culture, African language, African communication systems were to our freedom. And in a place like the US, they are not so concerned about freedom and justice, apparently. In 1741, the New York conspiracy in the province of New York was suppressed. In 1760, Taki's War. Taki came from right here in Ghana. He's thought to be Ghana. In British Jamaica, suppressed as well. Now, I saw a meme online, and in the meme it said, we are not our ancestors, we will fight back. This is a meme from someone who's sitting behind their computer and they are disparaging our ancestors out of sheer abject ignorance because they, sitting behind their laptops, are not willing to fight for anything, but meanwhile we have revolt and revolution after revolt and revolution. We were not sitting there idly by as contented enslaved Africans. Right, so 1791, the Mina conspiracy. Mina also was a term used to apply to this area that we are right now. And Louisiana, New Spain, that was suppressed. 1795, emancipation?
Free African nation.
You said all these dates, I'm falling asleep. I'll get you. Emancipation?
Free African nation.
Emancipation?
Free African nation.
Now you need to know these because I want you to verify it. Maybe Dr. Kamba is making this all up. Maybe our ancestors were just sitting around and saying, oh, yes, boss, yes, master, I sure do enjoy enslavement. But I don't think that's the case. I want you to verify any and everything that I'm telling you here. Right, and the sources are there. In 1795, the Point Coupé conspiracy, Louisiana, New Spain, that one was suppressed. In 1791 to 1804, the Haitian Revolution. If I was wearing a hat, I would take my hat off to these Africans. And why? And you should too. Continental Africans should take our hats off to this because of this, this is why they abolished the quote-unquote trade, right? And we'll come back to that point. If not for this, you would be walking around and I promise someone will kidnap you and you would find yourself sitting somewhere on a ship. So this had reverberations and repercussions throughout the world. If not for this, there would be no Louisiana Purchase, right? All you would have is the East Coast. So there would be no East versus West hip-hop beef because there would be no West. And French Saint-Domingue was later known as Haiti, that was victorious. Emancipation?
Free African nation.
Emancipation?
Free African nation.
Emancipation.
Free African nation.
Very good. Emancipation?
Free African nation.
1800, none like Gabriel Prosser in Virginia, this one was suppressed. And what he wanted to do is to eventually storm the capital of Washington, D.C., and actually make that a free land. Unfortunately, that place is still harboring enslaved Africans to this day. In 1803, Igbo landed St. Simon's Island, Georgia, this one was suppressed. In 1805, Chatham Manor, this one was also suppressed. It's like barely we can get past a year or two without Africans rising up to fight for justice, to fight for the restoration of Ma'at in the world. In 1811, the German Coast Uprising, which is considered by some to be the largest uprising in the United States history. For me, it's number 2, and I'll tell you why. Emancipation?
Freedom. Emancipation.
This is in the territory of Orleans. It was suppressed. And these are Africans out of Haiti who are transported to the Louisiana territory from the enslavers who wanted to keep their enslaved Africans, but those enslaved Africans knew what they just experienced. In 1815, George Boxley in Virginia, this one was suppressed. In 1816, Busa's Rebellion, British Barbados, was suppressed. In 1822, Denmark Vesey in South Carolina, this one was also suppressed. In 1831, my man, as a matter of fact, today I'm wearing some shoes, and you'll see on the back it says Nat Turner, right? Red, black, and green, Nat Turner. So if you want to use some Nat Turners, we celebrate our great and esteemed African ancestors, right? So 1831, Nat Turner's Rebellion in Virginia. Unfortunately, this one was suppressed. Emancipation?
Freedom.
1831 to 1832, the Baptist War of British Jamaica. This one was suppressed, but this is very important to ending chattel enslavement as we know it. You remember the dates 1807 for the abolishment of the quote-unquote trade, and 1833, 1834 for the abolishment of chattel enslavement. That we'll look at that as a reaction to this. 1839, Amistad, there was a movie about that, the ship rebellion off the Cuban coast. That one was victorious. 1841, the Creole case, the ship rebellion off the southern U.S. coast, that one was victorious. 1842, the slave revolt in the Cherokee Nation and Indian Territory, that one was suppressed. Now, a lot of you don't know that the people who we refer to respectfully as the indigenous people of the U.S. were some of the worst and most vicious enslavers of black people. Is anyone aware of that? Very good. Very good. So sometimes we like to hold hands and sing Kumbaya and say, oh, everyone is our good buddy. But when we actually look at the actual sources, we'll say that that was not always the case. And oftentimes that was not. You had Africans who had to escape what's now modern day Oklahoma, trying to seek refuge in Mexico. Some of them got there, and you still have black communities in Mexico from that. In 1859, you had John Brown's raid, Virginia. That one was suppressed. Now, I want us to just focus in on a few of these uprisings, because again, our topic is the African people who emancipated themselves. And we've seen time and time, all of these ones that are victorious, you see what? African people emancipating themselves. We see fighting for emancipation.
Free black nation.
So you think if I don't say it like a shout, so you're not supposed to respond. Emancipation?
Free nation.
So 1811, the German Coast Uprising was a revolt of black slaves. This is a quote, of course we don't like that term. In parts of the territory of Orleans on January 8th through 10th, 1811. The uprising occurred on the east bank of the Mississippi River in what are now St. John the Baptist and St. Charles parishes, Louisiana. While the insurgency was the largest in U.S. history, the rebels killed only 2 white men. Confrontations with militia and executions after the trial killed 95 black people because they were fighting against justice. Between 64 and 125 enslaved men marched from sugar plantations near present-day La Place on the German coast toward the city of New Orleans. They collected more men along the way. Some accounts claim a total of 200 to 500 enslaved Africans, as we would prefer, participated. During their 2-day, 20-mile march, the men burned 5 plantation houses, 3 completely, several sugar houses and crops. They were armed mostly with hand tools. White men led by officials of the territory formed militia companies to hunt down and kill the insurgents. That's their term. We would say freedom fighters. Over the next 2 weeks, white planters and officials interrogated, tried, and executed an additional 44 insurgents who had been captured. Executions were by hanging or decapitation. Whites displayed the bodies as a warning to intimidate slaves. The heads of some were put on pikes and displayed at plantations, right? It sounds like at this point in time we need a war on terror. Because what are we dealing with but pure terrorism? Also, we have the Berbice Uprising, and I just selected a few. You can look more in depth into all of these, because all of them are significant. The Berbice Uprising was a revolt in Guyana that began on the 23rd of February, 1763, and lasted into 1764. In 1762, the population of the Dutch colony of Berbice included 3,833 enslaved blacks, 244 enslaved Amerindians or indigenous people, and 346 whites. I think those of us who know how to do math, we say, I think we have a majority here. On 23rd February 1763, slaves, quote unquote, on plantation Magdalenenburg on the Conde River in Berbice rebelled, protesting harsh and inhumane treatment. They torched the plantation house. They went to other plantations to mobilize other enslaved Africans to join the rebellion. Kofi, as they would say, or in Ghana we would say what? Kofi. A house slave at Lilienburg, another plantation on Kanje, is said to have organized them into a military unit. As plantation after plantation fell to the slaves, the Dutch settlers fled northward and the rebels began to take over control of the region. For almost a year, the rebels held on to southern Berbice, while the whites were able to hold on to the north. Eventually, only half of the white population that had lived in the colony remained. The insurgents were eventually defeated in the spring of 1764 with the assistance of troops from the neighboring French and British colonies and from Europe, right? So what the whites realized is that regardless of their nationality, they had common enemies in the blacks. And what the blacks realized is that even though when they were shipped there, some were calling themselves Asante, some were calling themselves Fanti, some were calling themselves Ga, some were calling themselves Achim, some were calling themselves Yoruba, some were calling themselves Fong. What they realized is that all of those fragments and divisions made absolutely no difference. That they had to fight back on the basis of what they had in common, and that was that they were all black people, right? Again, we saw an enslaved traditional ruler, right, in Benkos Bioho. So they didn't say, oh, let's only enslave the lower class people and leave the upper class. They didn't say, let's enslave the upper class. So they said, it's not a class thing. If you're black, you are the enemy of the whites. So for us, we fought back on that basis as well. And the Bayano Wars. The Bayano Wars were armed conflicts in the Isthmus of Panama that occurred between the Bayano of Panama and the Spanish Crown Emancipation.
Free Black Nation.
One person. Everyone else was daydreaming, thinking about some of these things. The first war of the Bayano took place from 1548 to 1558, while the second war took place from 1579 and 1582. What happened to our year of return? 1619. Wasn't that the beginning of all of this? For some of us who can do math, we know what's going on. But if they want to do their tourist thing, let them do it. We won't step on their toes. Because ultimately, we're interested in emancipation.
Free Black Nation.
I want to get you, So successive uprisings of enslaved Africans against the rulers of the time, which was the origin for the Bayano Wars. We also have the Khorasan revolt of enslaved Africans, and that was in 1795, another major one. So from 17th August, 1795, and this is a very important date. This is the date I was married on.
Okay.
And it's also the date that Nana Marcus Garvey was born on. To 19 September 1795, location in Khorasan. So the outcome of the revolt was eventually subdued. Tula, Bastien Papata, Louis Mercier, Pedro Wacao, and others were executed. Slaves received limited rights. A revolt took place in the Dutch colony of Khorasan, led by Tula, and it resulted in a month-long conflict on the island. And this is marked through a memorial there. We also had the Creole case, which was also all about emancipation.
Free black nations.
Can't trick you no more, right? I'm wondering, because it's like they keep tricking us over and over again. We need to learn our lessons, right? About some of these things. So the Creole case was the result of an American slave revolt in November 1841 on board the Creole, a ship involved in United States coastwise slave trade. As 128 slaves gained freedom after the rebels ordered the ship sail to Nassau. So this is hijacking before hijacking, a carjacking before a carjacking, a shipjacking. It has been termed the most successful slave revolt in U.S. history. 2 persons died as a result of the revolt, a black slave and a white slave trader, right? We also have the Demerara Rebellion of 1823, which was also all about emancipation.
Free black nations.
Emancipation!
Free African nation.
Emancipation!
Free African
Emancipation!
Free African nation.
So the Demerara Rebellion of 1823 was an uprising involving more than 10,000 enslaved Africans, as we prefer, again this is a quote, that took place in the Crown Colony of Demerara, Essequibo, now part of Guyana. Large group of blacks, enslaved Africans, forced the retreat of European soldiers. This includes canal, boats, drawbridge, dwellings, guns, muskets, flags, hostages, dogs, and other bayonets. They forced the retreat of European soldiers led by Lieutenant Brady, right? So the participants included Jack Gladstone and Kwame. What's up with these Ghanaians? It seems like they're not willing to just sit around and be enslaved. Perhaps this is why Ghana was the first one to get flag independence at least. We're looking for even more substantive independence where we don't have U.S. military bases and Gandhi statues and all these things plopped on us, but we're getting there little by little. So again, and over 10,000 enslaved Africans against the plantocracy. Eventually it was subdued and hundreds of enslaved Africans were killed. Fighting against injustice, this is what we see, right? Emancipation!
Free black nations.
Emancipation!
Free African nations.
So we see rebellions in the West Indies. Huge slave rebellions that shook the West Indies are another factor that helped end British slavery, but have received little attention in Britain until recently. The first time the British Army faced a slave revolt beyond its control was actually not on British territory. In 1793, when Britain was at war with France, it invaded the French territory of Saint-Domingue, Haiti. The British Army wanted to seize this lucrative colony for itself and suppress a vast slave uprising taking place in Saint-Domingue before it could spread to the nearby British colony of Jamaica. And we see this as a common theme. We have to stop freedom and justice before it spreads. The army failed. We're talking about the British Army failed miserably. 5 years and more than 12,000 British, let me say that one more time. 12,000. If I ask you to count to 12,000, you will say, I don't have enough time to do it. 5 years and more than 12,000 British deaths later, the Redcoats withdrew. The Redcoats are coming, the Redcoats are coming. No, the Redcoats are going, the Redcoats are going. Let them go. An army of rebel enslaved Africans had defeated the army of the world's superpower and the largest slave trading nation. The humiliation of this defeat sent a shockwave through the British establishment. This was not a secret at all. Even though we don't hear about that reaction now, right? All we hear is, oh, they played the violins. They said, oh, let me take pity on these poor Africans. That's not what they were saying at the time. They were singing a different tune. So the humiliation of this defeat sent a shockwave through the British establishment and indirectly strengthened the forces in Parliament that voted to abolish the slave trade in 1807, because they realized if they don't do something, Haiti is going to be the entire world. And we see this time and again, because this is about emancipation.
Free black nation.
Oh, good. Even me, I wasn't even ready for that. So new uprisings shook the British Caribbean in later years. The greatest of them erupted in Jamaica at the end of 1831. So first we see the correlation between whooping the British behinds in Haiti. And now we're gonna see a correlation between 1831 and then eventually abolishing chattel enslavement as we knew it. More than 20,000 captives seized control of much of the northwest corner of the island, setting planters' houses on fire. Many of these were on ridges or hilltops, and as they burst into flames, they acted like beacons to spread the revolt, right? The shining light of liberty. It took the British Army and militia a month to get the country under control. Some 200 enslaved Africans and 14 white people died in the fighting. At least 340 more slave rebels were hanged or shot afterwards. In Britain, news of the revolt almost certainly hastened the coming of emancipation.
Free plantation.
Oh, good. Very good, very good. Both private correspondence and testimony before Parliament showed that colonial officials and high-ranking military men expected more revolts and feared, that word comes up a lot, and feared that the British military might not be able to contain them because they didn't do such a good job before, right? It was no coincidence that the new Parliament voted to free the slaves the following year. So this isn't sympathy, this is a reaction. This is a knee-jerk reaction to getting your butt whooped, right? So Nana Malcolm X said that we try to speak to them in French, we try to speak to them in English, we try to speak to them in Portuguese, but the language apparently that they understand is violence, right? And this is from the BBC's website. The grudge against Haiti, and we see this under President Thomas Jefferson, himself a notorious enslaver and rapist. I hope everyone knows that. Oh, good. Under President Thomas Jefferson's presidency, the United States cut off aid to Louverture and instead pursued a policy to isolate Haiti, fearing that the Haitian Revolution would spread to where?
United States.
And unfortunately it didn't, which is why the United States is still an enslaving nation to this day. These concerns were in fact unfounded, as a fledgling Haitian state was more concerned with its own survival than with exporting revolution. Nevertheless, Jefferson grew even more hostile after Louverture's successor, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, the great illustrious Jean-Jacques Dessalines, ordered the execution of whites remaining after the Napoleonic attempt to reconquer Saint-Domingue and reimpose slavery. The French defeat led to the Louisiana Purchase. Jefferson refused to recognize Haitian independence, a policy to which U.S. Federalists also acquiesced. Although France recognized Haitian independence in 1825, Haitians would have to wait until 1862 for the United States to recognize Haiti's status as a sovereign, independent nation, and this is according to the State Department of the United States. Now we see that Haiti had ripple effects, right? Because others heard about this and it exported the idea of emancipation.
Free black nations.
Emancipation!
Free African nations. Free black nations.
Emancipation!
Free black nations.
Very good. We also have the Malay Revolt, and this is why the Tabon people are here in Ghana right now. So this is known as the Great Revolt. It's perhaps the most significant slave rebellion in Brazil. On a Sunday during Ramadan in January 1835, in the city of Salvador da Bahia, a small group of black slaves, or as we prefer, enslaved Africans, and freedmen inspired by Muslim teachers rose up against the government. Muslims were called Malay, and it's coming from the Yoruba Imale. In Bahia at this time, from Yoruba Imale, that designated a Yoruba Muslim. The slaves knew about the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, even though the roots come even before that, and wore necklaces bearing the image of President Dessalines, who had declared Haitian independence. So Africans are being inspired to free themselves. And this is the one that ended chattel enslavement altogether. There had been a number of rebellions by enslaved Africans on the island of Jamaica Emancipation.
Free black nations.
16 slave rebellions had taken place between 1655 and 1813. There were also major uprisings in 1816 and 1823. By the 1820s, more than 2,500 enslaved people were escaping from the plantations each year. Remember that meme, I'm not like my ancestors, I will fight back? If I knew who did that meme, I would just send them a nice email, probably. In 1831 saw the largest slave uprising. It started with the enslaved people refusing to work. The strike was meant to be peaceful with the aim of forcing the owners to pay the enslaved people to cut the cane so it would not spoil. Things soon escalated. Enslaved Africans burnt down houses and warehouses full of sugar cane, causing over £1 million worth of damage. More than 200 plantations in the north of Jamaica were attacked as 20,000 enslaved people seized control of large chunks of land. The rebels were led by Samuel Sharp. The main rebellion lasted 10 days, but it took British troops the whole of January 1832 to restore order. It resulted in the death of nearly 200 Africans and 14 British planters or overseers. However, the repercussions of the rebellion were more terrible. Hundreds of the rebels were captured, and over 750 were convicted, of which 138 were sentenced to death. Some were hanged, others were shot by a firing squad. Most of those who escaped the death sentence were brutally punished, sometimes so harshly that they died anyway. Sharp was executed in public. The revolt was very important and helped to end British slavery. It also shocked the British government and made them see that the costs and dangers of keeping slavery in the West Indies were too high. It reminded many of the Sandominian rebellion where they got their butts whooped previously. I added that butts whoop part. That's not a direct quote. And here we come to, very good, and this is from abolition. There were fears of another major rebellion on Jamaica, and many terrified, you see that word come up a lot, not moral, terrified plantation owners were now ready to accept abolition rather than risk a widespread war. Just 1 week after Sharp's death, Parliament appointed a committee to consider ways of ending slavery. Now, is this moral suasion or is this a reaction? 1 week. 1 week. I think it was the latter. Now we come to the greatest rebellion of enslaved Africans in modern history. This is the Southern enslaved Africans in the American Civil War, right? So usually people talk about the German Coast Uprising, but the African people, the black people who fought in the Civil War were the main actors in their own emancipation. So by the time the war ended in 1865, about 180,000 black men had served as soldiers in the US Army. This was about 10% of the total Union fighting force. Most, about 90,000, were former or contraband enslaved Africans from the Confederate States. About half of the rest were from loyal border states. The rest were free blacks from the North. 40,000 black soldiers died in the war, 10,000 in battle, and 30,000 from illness or infection. So this is on a huge scale, 180,000 black people fighting for their liberation. Now before that, there was a stalemate between the North and the South. But I'll put it in terms of Nana Kwame Ture. He said, if you tell me the same white man who raped my mama, hung my daddy, whipped my brother, whipped me, and you tell me get a gun and then go fight him, man, shoot. So it was their own actions that ultimately contributed to the ending of chattel enslavement as we know it. So in conclusion, we had Africans emancipating ourselves from chattel enslavement. There was Haiti as the ever-looming and imminent threat of the U.S. becoming another Haiti. This stirred all the pale white Eurasians to cut their losses and forced them to transform chattel enslavement into all of the insidious forms of enslavement that exist under other names now, most notably imprisonment. Also note that in the U.S. today, enslavement has never been abolished per constitutional amendment. And for those who would point me to the 13th Amendment, there was actually a documentary called 13th, and I wrote an article on this a few years before that documentary came out. And let's look at the wording of the 13th Amendment. It says, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Now this is a major caveat, except as a punishment for a crime. This means that all I have to do as a white person is say you committed a crime, and now enslavement and involuntary servitude shall exist within these United States. Now they were not oblivious to the fact that they added in that caveat, because right after this you had the convict leasing system, and there's a good book called Slavery by Another Name that goes into this. So anytime they need the cotton to be picked for free, guess what? There's a crime wave. Anytime they need the swamps to be drained, there's another crime wave. And in modern times, anytime Dell, HP, Compaq, Boeing, and the list goes on, need people to assemble computers, guess what? There's a crime wave.
Sometimes they think you're going to put just water.
Exactly. So they have these laws where sometimes, and this comes in the book as well, sometimes they'll say if you have no proof that you have employment, you're loitering, you have to go to prison. And they had a quote from one of those who was the guard at one of these places called Parchment Plantation. And he said, this is even better than slavery. In slavery, you have to pay for their clothes and look after them and feed them even during the winter when they're not productive. With this, you can arrest one, work him to death, and then you just go arrest another one. And this is what you saw time and again. You have one African whose quota is 3 and 4 tons of coal per day, and they have to wade in water all the way up to their waist. And they're not allowed to get out to drink. And they're not allowed to get out to defecate. They're not allowed to get out to urinate. So if they need to drink, emancipation? Freedom. Emancipation? Freedom. Right? So you are liable to be enslaved at any moment on the whim of a white person saying you committed a crime as long as you are there in the US. Keep in mind that the whims of white people are quite whimsical. Because even to this day, sprinkle a little crack on you. Whether you did it or not, and at this point in time, you couldn't even testify in court. So if they say that you stole a 2x4 from a fence, you could have a death sentence. Because they would sentence you, you would be worked to death under these conditions. And then all they have to do is go enslave another one. So what we did is we forced the end of chattel enslavement as we knew it, but perhaps there's time for emancipation, where we can end enslavement and all these other insidious forms. So the side effect of criminalization by the modern day lynching with impunity by police patty rollers, modern times they call them patrollers, and basically any white with a gun. So we saw this with Trayvon Martin, where you can have a death sentence for walking down your street. I think we need some emancipation. Emancipation. So there's the article I mentioned, Legacies and the Impact of Transatlantic Enslavement on the Diaspora, and that came out in 2015, and you should check that out. So when we discuss the legacies and impact of transatlantic enslavement on the diaspora, we must consider several issues. Among these is the tendency of the word legacy to have a positive connotation for many, where the enslavement of African people may fail with regard to this criterion. More importantly, in this paper, I draw the reader's attention to the fact that in many places, such as the United States, slavery has never been abolished by law, merely renamed. So after enslavement, then it was called convict leasing. Then it was called debt peonage. Then it was called sharecropping. In modern times, it's called the prison industrial complex in these privatized prisons. As such, it becomes difficult to discuss a legacy or aftermath of something that is still in progress. Therefore, we'll take the United States as a case study of slavery, changing names and forms, yet remaining essentially the same spirit and nature, if not worse, in terms of impact on black people. And Michelle Alexander documents that more black people are enslaved working for free in the United States prison system today than those who were enslaved in 1865. So in conclusion, Madame Wasi, Nyeriwala Don Akwenami. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Doc. At this point, we would open the floor for questions. If anybody has questions for him? Yes.
Greetings, you also. How do you interpret the cases where you have the Maroons ending up through the law of the treaty supporting the plantation system? Curious to hear your take on that.
Yeah, so it actually comes up in this book as well, and so, it's been documented that oftentimes what we fail to realize is that if you make a treaty with someone who is your sworn enemy, that those treaties may not be in your best interest. And we see this even if we talk about, we mentioned briefly the indigenous people of the United States, what's now the United States. They had over 500 treaties in the United States, broke every single last one without exception. And we saw the same thing, I mentioned Palenque, right, in Colombia, where you had a treaty that was signed. However, Bencos Miojo, as he's walking through Cartagena, he's captured, he's in prison for 2 years, then he's hung and then quartered, right? So if we don't understand, and again, this was the quote from the great Nana Babi E. Wright, where he says we're trying to use moral suasion, and we're dealing with them as though they're rational human beings, where when race is a variable, there's no rationality there, right? It's white on top, black on the bottom. Anything in between, we can switch those around, but that has to stay fundamentally the case. It's basically the version of the white god, black devil, just
So it's
put
divide
on.
and rule, you see divide and conquer. So these
This is what you'll see, exactly, divide and conquer. So you have the Africans who are winning these wars, they're not able to subdue them. So they say, okay, we'll leave you alone, but we see this treaty. You see the same thing in Quilombo, right? You had Ganga Zumba, right? This peace treaty issue coming again. You have Zumbi dos Palmares who says we shouldn't sign this treaty. We see time and time again that we don't really understand the nature of who we're dealing with. If we understood, then we would realize that the treaty is worth less than toilet paper that's been used, right? So and basically these clauses are basically fail-safes so that in any case that they want to betray the treaty, then they'll say, oh, you took an enslaved African, right? Even if you didn't, even if you say, I'm going to abide by my word, yes, 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 then this becomes a way that they can now reinitiate these wars. So again, if we're about restoring Ma'at, we have to think about learning lessons from history. I mentioned the same thing with this US military base, and I have an article coming up right now, where according to the US Department of Defense, what they're bringing here to Ghana fits all 3 definitions of a military base, right? That's one. And then beyond that, if we don't understand, there's an article dealing with the United States impunity, where various agreements, various treaties, whether it's climate change agreements, whether it is being part of the UN, whatever, the US violates treaties all the time, all the time, all the time. So here in Ghana, we say, oh, let's sign this down, and then they're going to abide by it. And this is not the case, that they say they have no permanent friends or allies, only permanent interests. And you see this even in the farewell speech of George Washington, who says that we should make no permanent alliances. And you have this isolationism coming from there. They're interested in their own interests, but it's not only the US, it stretches across to this rhetorical ethic. They'll say all men are created equal. The same one who wrote that down has over 500 enslaved Africans, and he's raping Sally Hemings every night. The same French people, the French Revolution, right? The exact same generation who's saying liberté, égalité, fraternité are the same ones who go into Haiti to reestablish enslavement, just like they had tried to do in Martinique before that. But we don't understand this. We think that they're going to live up to what they say, but we have to understand hypocrisy as a way of life. To really understand this, there's a good book called Yurugu by Dr. Marimba Ani that goes into that.
I have one more question too, sorry. The role of African women, can you speak to that? The role of African black women in these revolutions?
Very good. So you have some of the more famous names, such as Queen Nani of the Maroons. You see women, you have Dendara in Quilombo. You have all of these cases where women oftentimes led the revolution themselves. So their role cannot be understated. Even in the Haitian Revolution, you had all of these women who are even the key organizers who are part of the revolution, right? So if you look at someone like Dessalines, he was trained up by a woman. So all of these things we have to keep in mind. And this is, even bringing this up, this is also part of the divide and conquer. Because when they were enslaving black people, they didn't say, all right, we're only going to take the men and leave the women. They didn't say, we're only going to take the women and leave the men, right? But oftentimes, part of the divide and conquer is pitting black men and black women against each other, and they laugh all the way to the bank. So we have to be very cognizant of that and not allow that to take place.
If you could bring that up to date, like right now,
Right.
we have a so-called African Union, and you have some of the people who are responsible for enslaving African people, part of the African Union.
Yes.
How does that work? And how can there be liberation of an African nation or African continent when you got a whole segment of the population who are responsible for more atrocities than you just put up there?
Yes. Yes. This is an excellent question. And I actually just gave a talk on this at the AAPC, where I was looking at a case study of Haiti, Morocco, and the AU. If you just do a search for it, you'll see the video of it with all the slides embedded. Now, in 2016, Haiti, which is the reason why you can walk down the street without being kidnapped and captured, Haiti applied to join the African Union, and they were rejected. In that exact same year, 2016, Morocco, where the word for slave and black person is the same word, Abid. Morocco applied in that exact same year to join the African Union. Morocco has over 200,000 Abid, meaning black, meaning slave, same word, not different word, same word. Now, let's put this in perspective. You'll remember not too long ago, there was this uproar about Libya, right? Enslavement going on in Libya because of video circulating. When I saw people up in arms, I said, the world is laughing at you. Because Libya is the small man on the totem pole. Somewhere around 80,000 enslaved black people. Meanwhile, Morocco has over 200,000 enslaved black people. You can look up a global slavery index for those who are taking notes, global slavery index. Now, Libya, somewhere around 79, even 79 to 80,000. Even tiny Tunisia has around 85,000 enslaved black people. Before we come to Sudan, these whites who call themselves Arabs there in northern Sudan, how they enslaved the black people there, over 500,000 enslaved black people in Sudan.
And they're part of the African Union.
And they're part of the African Union. Meanwhile, in Egypt, what used to be called Kemet, the land of black people, over 500,000 enslaved black people. Right? Mauritania, over 40,000 enslaved black people. So all of these places, so what you bring up is a major case that we need to look at, because all of these who are in North Africa, they have the Arab League. That means they know who they are. Meanwhile, we don't have a black league. We're not even allowed to call ourselves black because that's reverse racism or whatever it's supposed to be called. So they can unite on the basis of who they are and where they come from. If you even look at Libya, everyone loves Gaddafi. Not everyone, some. But if you look at every single year, every single day he's in power, the name Libya always has Arab in it. Arab Jamahariya, Arab this, Arab that. They're very clear on who they are, right?
Egypt is even the United Arab Republic.
Very good, United Arab Republic. So all of these, they know who they are. Meanwhile, we're still signing treaties. Perhaps we haven't learned a lesson, right? So this is something that we definitely need to, and I sent this to the deputy chair of the African Union, that talk that I gave, because when I spoke to him about it before, he said, it requires education, because when we understand African, we think it means whoever happens to be on the African continent, whether they are enslavers, our very first enslavers, our very first colonizers, our very first rapists are still here on stolen land. There's a good documentary called Black Mummy of the Green Sahara that goes back 5,600 years, and it documents that Libya, the very first case of mummification, was there in southwestern Libya, and there was a young black boy. What we get from that is that land used to be occupied by black people before it was stolen and taken by the current Arab invaders who are still there now. And some say, oh, well, they're Arabized Berbers or whatever they call themselves, Arabs, you let them do what they are. What we know is that they are not indigenous to the land of black people, Kemet, right? So I definitely appreciate you bringing this up. And it's something that really requires us to interrogate something. And it makes us have to question whether the African Union, which is to a large part set up by the money of Gaddafi, maybe they've been bought up. Or perhaps they weren't set up to do anything other than that in the first place. So if I see a gun and it shoots me, I don't say that gun is broken. That's what the gun was manufactured to do. So perhaps the AU is doing exactly what it was manufactured to do. Split us up, black people, and then link us together with our past, current, and future opponents and or enslavers and enemies.
What about the situation in South Africa? I understand that a lot of South Africans are rejecting what Mandela had set up. And even to this day, when Mandela came out, it was 1992, even to this day, the whites still own the wealth, and that has not been shared. what do you think about the situation today?
Yeah, so, you have lots of people who say, it's all about,
Oh, I'm sorry, I just wanted to interject one more thing in
problem.
my question. They had this Truth Commission that was supposed to absolve
Yeah.
white people of all the past atrocities that were committed with no recompense to the population. Just say, okay, I did this, and that's it. Everything is even. So then now you can answer.
no problem. So what I want to do is tie that into the so-called xenophobic attacks from a couple of years ago, which still go on in spurts here and there. And what I found, I want to draw a comparison, I think we mentioned this before, where anytime you have people who are oppressed by a common oppressor, they'll unite on the basis of what they have in common, right? So you'll see, in South Africa, you had people who used to fight against each other. Some people who call themselves AmaZulu, others who call themselves AmaXhosa, others who call themselves Mpondomise and Basotho, and so forth and so on. But at a certain point in time, there was a push called Black Consciousness, which said all of these divisions are not necessarily helpful for us. We need to come together on the basis of what we have in common, right? So you see that there in South Africa, but that African who was one of the main proponents, Nana Bantu Steve Biko, was killed for his efforts. Because for us to come together on the basis of we're all black people, this is the major challenge to the white hegemony there. They want us to separate ourselves on the basis of class and gender and this and that and whatever, right? And what we see is things just like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I haven't met a South African who I respect who hasn't seen Nelson Mandela as a sellout. Not that I respect you because of that, but I'm just giving you a correlation. That when I talk to someone who I have any respect for, when we start dealing with Nelson Mandela, they say, oh, he's just a straight sellout, right? Now, again, this is what you see. You see the wealth, and let me give you another quote by the late Nana Khalid Muhammad, where he says, anytime he goes to a capitalist nation, it's white capitalists on top and black capitalists on the bottom. If he goes to a socialist nation, and there are some that are out there, he sees white socialists on top and black socialists on the bottom. When you see a communist nation, it's white communists on top, black communists on the bottom. He says anytime he goes to a Christian nation, it's white Christians on top, black Christians on the bottom. He goes to a Muslim nation, it's white Muslims on top, black Muslims on the bottom, right? So when I look at something like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, what I see is a solution to a problem that's not a problem. What they're doing is they're saying your whole problem is apartheid. You are apart from the white people, now we'll resolve it, now you can come closer to them. But in doing that, what they're doing is obfuscating the actual problem, which is genocide. According to the UN definition of genocide, killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, bringing about conditions to destroy the group in whole or in part, preventing births within the group, and then forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. That's the 5-part definition of genocide. And that's what you have there in South Africa. But rather than dealing with genocide, all we deal with is now you don't have to be apart from white people, so now shut up, you don't have anything to say. So what I see that as is an intentional, inappropriate response to the actual problem. So rather than actually dealing with the problem, they rent you a cure for the symptoms. So it's something for us to keep in mind.
Yeah, on one of your graphs that you had, you was reading how a sociopath, a psychopath, has no idea that they're doing anything wrong.
Not that they have no idea, they just don't care. They ignore the idea of right and wrong.
So that mental sickness, a sociopath, schizophrenia, that's a mental situation. That, and my second question is, natural nature, the forces of nature, will take its course in time on everybody. What would you say? What's your take on that?
Very good. So one, just in terms of the mental condition, this is dealt with in a book called Intellectual Warfare, again by Imafu Jedi Shemsu Jehuti, where he looks at Sekhanta Diop's two-cradle theory, northern and southern cradle, and he even traces it back to the instructions of Mary Carré in what they call the very first intermediate period, which is when the central order of Kemet broke down. And in the instructions to Mary Claret, it talks about these pale white Eurasians that we nowadays call Arabs or whatever we call them. And it says, lo, the miserable Asiatic, he's wretched because of the place he's in. So basically it traces their mental issues to the environment that they're in, because there's so little resources. This is why they say might makes right. Because if there's only so much, if I have a bigger club than you, I can just beat you upside the head and eat your children, right? Survival of the fittest, only the strong survive. They're telling you through their proverbs what their environment perhaps has conditioned them to do. But in it, it says, again, lo, the miserable Asiatic is wretched because of the place he's in, short of water and bare of wood. His paths are many and difficult because of mountains. It goes on to say that he's like a thief that darks about in a group. He can snatch from a lonely road, but not from a populous town. He's like a crocodile on its shore. So it just goes on to all these different characteristics, but it attributes it firstly to the environment that they're in. And this is a similar thing to what Nana Sheikh Abdul did. He said because they're in these glacier, tundras, whatever, that has made their behavior what it is. And he wasn't the first to say that, and this is an ongoing discussion. But what is innovative about what Nana Jedi Shimsu Djibouti does is he says that at a certain point we have to question whether that process is reversible. That after tens of thousands of years in this type of situation, you may have a case where those exact same Eurasians can be in a place of plenty, like Africa, and they can commit the first genocide in the history of the world.
So you might not be able to reverse that.
That's the point. And more so in that court is dealing with how inappropriate it is to try to use moral suasion to deal with something that may have been building up for tens of thousands of years. There's a proverb in Chi that says, which is to say, if a tree takes 30 years to grow crooked, you can't straighten it in one day. But this is meanwhile what we're attempting to do. So even in a place of plenty, you can see that the very first Holocaust, and there's a book called The Kaiser's Holocaust, Germany's Forgotten Genocide, where the very first Holocaust wasn't against so-called Jews in so-called Europe, but it was in Namibia. That's where the origin of the concentration camps came from. So they can come to a place like Africa where we have plenty of resources, where we have in Namibia, places like that, they have diamonds that just wash up on the shore, right? But they can be in a place of plenty, but that doesn't mean, oh, now let's start sharing with everyone. What they did there, that was the extermination order by General von Drota to exterminate every single last Herero person, and then they extended it to the Nama people when they rose up in rebellion as well. So these are
forces of natural nature.
Right, so when we think about forces of nature, I will put it in terms of Ma'at. And when you look at Kemetic creation stories, it says that at the very beginning was Ma'at. It talks about Ptah, the creative divinity, laying a foundation in Ma'at and then speaking everything else into existence from there. And the idea is Ma'at exists on three different levels. On the cosmological level, meaning on the larger level, on the societal level, and then on the individual level. So the idea is that ultimately everything will end up in justice because it started off in justice, and Ma'at itself is written, the word itself is written with a pedestal saying that this is the foundation upon everything. But I don't think that we're the only ones who know this. When you look at, there's a proverb in Chi, and it translates to one who cuts throats is scared to lie on his back. So if you look at the defense budget, of the United States, it means that they know what they've done and they themselves think that they should pay for it, which is why they need all of these defensive weapons, right? If you haven't done anything, you can just say, oh, I'm chilling. But if you know all of the horrors and genocide, if you know that the land that you're standing on, you stole from someone who you raped, killed, murdered, garroted, so forth and so on, then you may have this idea, this paranoia, and the idea is that paranoia is the idea that all things are connected, that I did something, something's going to happen to me, right? So I think even they themselves think that ultimately, but I don't think it's up to us to just wait for, a storm to come by and magically in the by and by, Master gonna come back and the imaginary white boy's gonna come from off of his stick and save us from something. I don't think that's the thing. I think that what we have to really be about is playing a role in our own emancipation. Free Black Nation. Yeah, you gotta pay attention. Oh, you thought the lecture was over and I So I hope that's clear. Let's come here.
Yeah, I'm curious how you're defining like whiteness and blackness and race.
Right.
And some of these things that you're talking about are like millennia ago, before race was kind of institutionalized.
Right? This is what we're told, and apparently the idea is if we say this enough that it will magically become true, that the oldest mention of black people as black people is in the pyramid text, the oldest corpus in the history of the world, right? The oldest corpus of any type of text in the history of the world, it talks about the ruler, Pepi Merenre, Nesubiti Pepi Merenre, and it says, you stand at the forefront of the black people as the apeless bull, right? The very first idea of us as black people dates back over 4,000 years ago. But meanwhile, we're taught by people who don't know any ancient history, we're taught that being black was a reaction to white people saying they're white, and that was a justification for enslavement, and blah, blah, blah. And they think if they just say this, then magically it will just become true. But some of us can read. We're not literate. We can go back and read what our ancestors carved in stone. So the pyramid texts were carved in stone, so I can go back and read that at the very beginning of writing itself, we were calling ourselves black people. We called our land Kemet, which means land of black people, and we called ourselves Kemetiu. And what I was alluding to before is that anytime you're in a situation where you have a common enemy, you come together on the basis of what you have in common, and Kemet is an example of that. Look at their proximity to these exact same Eurasians, who they're talking about way back then as having to take military action against to defend themselves. So before that, I could say I'm from Ilnu, I can say you're from Abju, I can say you're from Abu, I can say you're from Medinit, I can say whatever, but at that point in time, they came together on the basis of we're all Kemetiu, and this is Kemet, the land of black people. So basically, anytime you have those types of conditions, we will come together on the basis of what we have in common instead of chopping ourselves up into these meaningless fragments. However, those exact same white people who we're fighting against way back at that point in time, they don't want us to come together on that basis. They want us to say, let's chop ourselves up in terms of gender, in terms of class, in terms of nation, in terms of blah, 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 blah. Because ultimately, self-preservation as the first law of nature, you were talking about nature, that is what would keep them safe. So we're not dealing with race, we're dealing with us calling ourselves black people and knowing that we're black people, and we have to document the documented evidence that our illustrious ancestors were kind enough to leave for us so we can go back and read it for ourselves. And this is also why we're not allowed to learn Medu-Neter, because then we would actually have the primary sources, and you have people like Marx who can't read Medu-Neter. He took the same stance as Hegel and all these other people that African people have no history until a white man sets foot there. So this is the blind leading the blind. If you don't know anything about ancient history, how am I going to follow you for a historical analysis of what's going on in the world? Primary text, primary text, primary text.
Yeah, my name's Aaliyah. Thank you for that year. I'm from the U.S., specifically Tennessee, and I attend a historically black college, and they're always trying to find students to like organize and mobilize against for different social justice movements and things like that. And I'm just wondering, like, what was your take on like the Black Lives Matter movement and things like that, which kind of sometimes don't really focus on like mass incarceration as much, and do you think like it should be nuanced in a way that focuses on that? And then what do you think about like what they call black on black violence, and like how should there be more organization on those things in the U.S.?
Right. So if we look at even the concept of Black Lives Matter, I think a lot can be learned from the White Lives Matter movement. Who's heard of the White Lives Matter movement? No. And I don't mean the modern day White Lives Matter movement. I mean some of the things that whites did in places like Kenya when they were starting colonization there. That what they did, and you see this in a documentary on Wangari Maathai, that there was a village that killed a white man, right? So what did they do? They went to that village and killed every single adult, elder, women. They just left the children so the children would be terrorized and grow up with the memory of what had transpired. That's how they told you that white lives matter. There's an incident narrated by Nikwesi Kwate here in what's now modern day Ghana, where you had the colonizers coming and they put their flag on the beach, and Afanti decided to take that flag and rip it up. So what did they do? They caught that man, they ripped his head off, and then they put it on a stake. They're even saying their flags matter. So they have a way, because that's the language that they're speaking, not Portuguese or French or Dutch or anything else. They're telling you, how do we show black people that white lives matter? If you have all of these so-called gangsters on the street corner, they know I can shoot this other black person, but I better not do anything to that white person, because they've been convinced in modern times that white lives matter, right? So I think that there's some type of lessons to be learned in terms of that type of movement. How can you convince people that your lives matter? It may not be through getting placards and signboards, because ultimately your placard and your signboard, you bought it at the Walmart. They're gonna take that money and then they're gonna buy a bullet, and then that bullet's gonna end up in your cousin. They're gonna take the tax, right, the income tax or whatever tax that comes, the purchasing tax on that. Then they're going to they're gonna build a prison that's going to enslave you again. So as long as we are in that space, we are to a very high degree financing our oppressors and financing the same enemy who is killing us. So that's my take, on the Black Lives Matter movement. I do think Black Lives Matter. I also think we need to decolonize the academy. I actually did a talk entitled that, Black Lives Matter and Decolonizing the Academy. But I think that there are a lot of lessons that can be gleaned from how do people show you that your lives matter? What's the right method to show? Tepa said.
Yeah. Can I ever, that was very well put. Can I ever get over plight, sorrow, oppression? Can I ever move past feeling like I'm a victim? Talk to people about that. Think that, if I can move past that, my plight, my circumstances.
Right. I think we could put it in perspective that the entire history of the United States has really just become a superpower, let's say after World War II, but even starting after World War I, right? So we're getting to just a little bit over 100 years. Now, this period of time is not even as long as an intermediate period of Kemet, right? The entire existence of this so-called superpower that people think is can't be defeated is not even up to the period of time of this unity, this organization inside of Kemet. So this means that at that point in time, people may have thought, oh, we're always going to be under, the Hyksos or whatever. But we were able to, in the very first war of African liberation against the Hyksos, you had these exact same pale white Eurasians coming in, raping, pillaging, plundering, causing death and destruction. If you were living at that time, you would just say, this is something that may just last forever. But none of these things last forever, because our ancient African ancestors knew the concept of khepra, change, right? So now, your role is, if you choose to accept it, is to, how can I assist this change? Now, I just gave a whole presentation on Africans who assisted that change. So just the fact that we can sit here and talk here in Africa as descendants of enslaved Africans, this means that our ancestors put in some serious work to even get us to this point.
That's right.
But we're not done. What they like for us to say is, we're done. Yes. You've been integrated, so shut up. No more apartheid, so shut up. No more untouchability in India, so shut up. Right? But once we understand that the actual problem is genocide, then we know that it's ongoing. Right?
Thanks.
You want?
I think it's very interesting that you use Ma'at as the heading for the rebellions, because often when we talk about Ma'at, we think that it is against Ma'at or against righteousness to fight back. That we would be just like them if we were to fight back, if we were to do what they have done to us.
Most people who say that to me in English. I'll be just like them, and they're saying it to me in English. And usually they're wearing white people clothes. And usually they're wearing white people shoes. And usually they're praying to an imaginary white boy in church every Sunday. If they're not doing that, they're praying to a rock in the desert 5 times a day. So these people who say, I'll be just like them if I do that. It's like, you're already. So this is the only thing that's going, right? I say that partially in jest, but mainly being serious. That this is why it's important for us to know the primary sources. Write down prophecy of Nefertiti. Prophecy of Nefertiti. Now, what the prophecy of Nefertiti does is it takes place in the court of Sennacherib, and it talks about how these pale white Eurasians, the exact same ones who are there now in Kemet, if we can still call it Kemet, because it's not so much the land of blacks anymore, but it talks about how they will come in and how they will overrun, how it will be like a pond full of feeders, the way that they're coming in, how they'll bring death and destruction. So you see this in Prophecy of Nefertiti, also Lamentation of Equal Wear, so forth and so on. But let's focus on Nefertiti. But then it says, but Ameni, son of a woman from Nehen in the south of Kemet, will rise up. It says, at that point in time, these Eurasians will fall to the flame, those ones will fall to the sword, and then Ma'at will return to her seat while Isfet is driven away.
The key is you have to drive Isfet.
You have to drive Isfet away. So, and they give you a method. It says these ones should fall to the flame, and we saw that there in the slide, right?
Yeah.
Those ones should fall to the sword. Then Ma'at will return to her seat while Isfet is driven away. So a lot of the New Age, Ma'at people, they've never read anything from our ancestors. If they actually read what our ancestors wrote, they wouldn't have this, kumbaya, let's all hands. That's, the fake fraud Ma'at, right? The Statue of Liberty is masquerading as Ma'at. We need to go and read what our ancestors wrote to actually understand the concepts. Otherwise, we're joking, we're playing, we're not being serious.
I've been looking for a copy, an original copy of the Prophecy of Nefertiti. I understand it's in Russia. The copy, the original copy is in Russia. And I've only seen the translation.
Oh, you can find the Medu Neter there, and I can share it with you.
I would like to get a copy of the Medu Neter.
Yes.
Now, is it in hieratic or is it in?
It's in, so anything that appears initially in hieratic, they make it into Medu Neter, and then they do the translation and transcription. I can even pull it up for you right here. I'm writing a book where that one comes up very prominently. But yeah, so I can definitely make that available. Let me see if this is it. Yeah, so this is, and you can find the original one that's done by hand, but this is right here, the Prophecy of Nefertiti, and you can find all of the Medu Neter there. But I have about 3 different copies, the hand one, and then also translations and transliterations, but all of that is available.
Okay, is there a website?
You can find a lot of text in Medu Neter on LibGen, Libgen. I'm not sure if I'm supposed to be plugging that site here. LIBGEN, Library of Genesis.
Question.
Yes.
We and I will be going to the slave castles in the forts.
Okay.
And as a African American, as an African coming back, lived in America,
All right.
what would you recommend? What kind of thinking process would you recommend going into those forts and dungeons?
The first thing I would recommend is not calling yourself an African American. As Nana Malcolm X said, you don't catch hell because you're a Mason or an elk or any of these things that we call ourselves. It's because you're a black man, you're an African. If you're an American, you wouldn't catch no hell. That's a paraphrase. So I think if I look at someone like Denmark Vesey, this is someone who I admire.
Yes.
If I look at someone like Nana Gabriel Prosser, who wanted to actually overrun the capital of the US, I wouldn't say that these are Americans. I would say that, if anything, one of the best things we could say to describe them is anti-Americans. Because when we look at what America actually stands for in terms of the enslavement of black people back then and right now to this day, then it's something that, if we're about truth, if we're about justice, if we're about Ma'at, for us to call ourselves and name ourselves after Amerigo Vespucci, there's something fundamentally problematic about that. And that's the reason why that term has taken off, right? Donald Trump said, we don't want to call it Black History Month again, we should call it African American History Month. Because if you're black, this means you see somebody from Cuba and you say, that's my brother. This means if you see someone from South Africa, you say, that's my sister. This means if you see someone from Brazil, that's my brother. We're all the same thing, we're all black. We're all commit to you, right? But if you see yourself as African American, this means I'm this fragment, and guess what? African Americans don't get along with Jamaicans. or Haitians.
Slavery.
Exactly, or continental Africans. This means Ghanaians don't get along with Nigerians. As long as we see ourselves as these teeny tiny fragments, there's a book by Nana Amos Wilson, Black on Black Violence, Black Self-Annihilation in Service of White Domination. And this is what we see, is if we can still see ourselves as these teeny tiny fragments and fight against each other, that's what got us into this place in the first place of even being enslaved. Because imagine if we said, look, we're all black people, and we need to unite against all those whites who are calling themselves Dutch and French and whatever. We'd have an entirely different situation. But we didn't see ourselves like that. We saw ourselves, there were no Africans at that point in time. There was I'm Fanti. Even within that, I'm this Asafo company number 1, and I don't like Asafo company number 7, right? Even in the same ethnic group, you have Achim versus Asante going way back to the time of Osetutu. All are supposed to be under the umbrella of Akan. You have Asante and Akwemu, or Achim and Akwemu, and all these teeny tiny fragments. So that's the first thing, is that I don't think you should see yourself as African American. You should see yourself as African, which is a synonym for black. You should see yourself as black, which is a synonym for African.
I didn't follow that. The Africans.
I define myself as an African in America.
I know, I said that at the very beginning. But what happened on the African continent to have such division between those tribes?
Right.
If they considered themselves African, one people?
Right.
What happened to divide all of that?
So there were several things, and this is something that I mentioned before, is that sometimes it's the context that brings about that type of unity. So if we look at a place like Kemet, where you have a common enemy right there at your border, then you will drop all of these different divisions and you'll say, well, we'll come together on the basis of we're all committed to you, we're all black people. In South Africa, you have all these different ethnic groups, but once they realize we have a common Dutch and British enemy, they come together on the basis of what they have in common. You have in Haiti, every single type of ethnic group being shipped there, but they realize that I'm not getting whipped because I'm Fon. They don't even know what a Fon is. We're all black people, so they come together on the basis of what they have in common, Les Noirs, right? Same thing in Jamaica. They come together on the basis of what they have in common. And it's not only human beings that do this. You could look at antelopes. If there's no predator around, they can butt heads all day long. Who cares?
Yes.
But once they realize that there are hyenas or lions around, then they start to realize we need to act as a unit on the basis of what we have in common, that we're all antelopes. So again, you can see this anytime you have that type of condition, then you have that same type of end result of coming together on the basis of what you have in common. When you're in a place like, modern day Ghana, or at that time Gold Coast, or even before then, there's no catalyst that would make you say we have to unite across on those broad lines on the basis of what we have in common. So if our Chims are fighting Asantes, who cares? It's all right, whatever. But once you realize you have a common enemy who's going to ultimately benefit from the fact that you're beating each other up. So it's what they call the gun slave cycle, right? So I'll give you some guns on credit. I'll give you some guns on credit. And all you have to do to pay me back is to bring me your enemies over there. You bring me your enemies over there. That's a good deal, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm laughing all the way to the bank because you think you're this, you think you're that. And I say all of these Negroes are in my palm. And we see this at the Berlin Conference. The whites came together on the basis of what they had in common. Before that, they were shooting each other out of the water with cannons. But they said the problems that we have amongst each other as white people should never supersede the problems we have with all of those Africans. So you see the Ottoman Empire was there at the Berlin Conference. Now they're not in Europe. People say Europeans. They're not in what they call Europe, even though Europe itself is a figment of imagination. It's not a continent. It's part of Eurasia. It's just one landmass. I want everyone to look on a satellite map and see it's all one thing, right? So they came together on the basis of what they had in common. They invited Russia. Russia isn't part of quote unquote Europe. They invited the United States. United States isn't part of so-called Europe. This is way before the Cold War. This is, they even ended up being allies in, world wars. But we see time and time again, they're willing to say whatever differences we have, those differences should never supersede the problems that we have with all those. And we're still needing to get to a point where we as black people are willing to come together on the basis of what we have in common, which is that we're all black people.
LBB4, me LBB2.
No, I don't know. Any ABB found here, and everyone.
Okay, so we would have two more questions,
Okay.
and then we would close shop.
Montessori said race first.
Great. Two more questions here.
How do you feel about people that are, quote unquote, mulatto, half white, half black, and where do they stand? Because it seems like when it comes down to wealth, on the white side, when it comes down to beating down some black people, they're on the white side. But when it comes down to wearing our clothes, speaking our language, doing all those things, then, and they want to dance, then it's on the black side. So what do you think about the mulattoes and how many mulattoes played in, how many mulattoes were there that was going on during this time that you were showing in the movie?
Very good. So I think this is an excellent question, and it's one that's been dealt with in Nana Chancellor Williams' book, Destruction of Black Civilization, where basically he looks at the intentional role and creation of mulattoes is for them to take the side of their white parent. And we see this happen time again, but then we also see some who do not. I think that we need to look at blackness on various levels, right? One is on the biogenetic level, that if you are descended from black people, if you can produce black people, that's one basic thing. So I can say, okay, you're black. But then beyond that level, we can look at it in terms of phenotype. So we can look at these like a gradient, right? How black are you biogenetically on this side versus where you get to a point where it's virtually statistically insignificant, right? That's on the biogenetic level. Then we can also look at it on the next level in terms of phenotype. So you have people who may not look the blackest of the black, but they may be for the cause. So we can also look at them on this thing. You have people who may be jet black, but they could be Clarence Thomas. Right? You can see that. So we need to look at it on multiple levels. Then look at another level in terms of allegiance, right? This is more intangible, but it's no less important. So on the scale, how much allegiance do you have to being black when the chips are down? This is one of the things that you're alluding to. And I think that's another level that we need to look on. Eventually you get to a point where your allegiance is statistically insignificant because we can't see it and we can't feel it, right? So I'm saying that we shouldn't just look at one of these vectors, we should look at multiple layers of being black/African. Then you can look at, identity as well, right? Do you yourself even identify with being black? So you have people who are you black? No, I'm British. If I could get some tea and crumpets, I'd have a right? So do you, or not even that, you can have people who identify as African American. They're saying, I'm not part of this larger whole, I'm this teeny tiny fragment, which does the same thing virtually. And then we can look at it on the level of character, right? How black are you in terms of character? Let's say you have all the allegiance in the world, you say I identify as a black person, but as soon as there's some money on the table, so your character is not reliable enough, even when you have all of these other things in place. So I think there are multiple levels that we need to look at this on. The mulatto question is at the basic level of, do you even qualify for the rest of the discussion? Right? Can you produce black people? If not, then all right, any of these other questions, we're not even going to go to those other levels.
There's a question on this side. Yes, go ahead.
Okay, so I have a question. Do you think that blackness can be defined outside of the context of oppression?
Yes. That's a short answer. Yes, because, for example, in the language of Songhai, you have Ghana, Mali, Songhai empires. Even though the original name of Ghana was Ouagadougou, not Ghana. The original name of Mali was Nyani, not Mali. That's referring to the Malinke people. And they have Gao, which is known to history as Songhai. So in that language, they have the word Bibi, and it's the same Bibi that we hear in the word Obibini in Chi and Abibimain as African, which equals black person, and land of black people, which is Abibimain. Exact same concept that you found in Kemet. Now, in the Songhai language, anytime they want to refer to something that's fertile or powerful or pure, they use the adjective Bibi. They say it's black, even if it's not physically black. This is the superlative that's used to apply to the thing. So if they say, I want some pure water, they will say, I know how to Bibi. Give me the black water, right? Anytime they want to say that the sun is at its highest point, right? They call it Wane Bibi, the black sun. Now they're looking at it, it's not like this color, but that's the concept that they have to say this is something that's powerful, right? If they want to say that the soil is fertile, they'll call it Sadi Zabibi, the black soil, right? Whether it's physically this color or not, this is the concept. So what we see is not universal. You know, in white languages like English, they're set up in such a way that they serve their makers, right? It's like if I raise a dog, an attack dog, I'm not raising it to come back and bite me on the neck. I'm raising it to serve my interests. And this is in their language. They'll say white is good and black is bad. White God, black devil, right? They'll say white is snow, pure, blah, blah, blah. We all know this stuff. But that's not a universal thing. If we look at the language of Mennonite in Kemet, or Ro in Kemet, the word Kim translates to perfection, completion, the ultimate, the final, the unsurpassable, right? So this is a concept that has absolutely nothing to do with oppression. It has something to do with, so even in a song, among the Songhai people, they have a story of a hyena who wanted a talisman, a charm, quote unquote, green, what they call it. And they asked for a talisman of this color. They said, oh, give me a white one. That one got dirty, you have to throw it away. Oh, give me a red one. Oh, that one got smudged, you have to throw it away. Give me this one. And then eventually he said, you should just choose the black one because everything comes to black. So if you combine all the colors together, that's where you get completion. That's from the Songhai people, that concept. So yes, I think part of the problem is that we have very short memories where we don't remember the time where black was seen as completion and perfection. They refer to Asar as the divinity of perfect blackness, right? Wen Nefer, like the being who is perfect. So these are some of the things that once we know better, then we can do better. As Dr. Renoko Rashid says, what we do for ourselves depends on what we think of ourselves. What we think of ourselves depends on what we know of ourselves. And what we know of ourselves depends on what we have been told about ourselves. So hopefully we've been taught a little bit about ourselves today. Then we can know a little bit more about ourselves. Then we can think a little bit better of ourselves. Then we can do something different from ourselves. So it starts with you. Thank you very much.
Who are that chair? Cool.
Okay, great. I'd like to say a big thank you to Dr. Obadele Kambon and for all the audience for the insightful questions and your very, very instructive answers to them. He is in the Department Institute of African Studies, so if anybody wants to further see for deeper conversations and all of that, he's located right there. He's a research fellow at the Institute.
Senior research fellow. I just got my promotion.
Yes, senior research fellow at the Institute. I believe that we have learned a lot in this short discussion or presentation that we have had. I know we have learned history in our schools. I was sitting back there, haven't learned about, didn't know the ancient name of Ghana, but it is important that such conversations go on and we ourselves take time to read about, like you said, primary text, and interrogate these major issues which will continue to shape our life. So on this note, I'd like to say thank you very much once again. He himself was a CIEE. When he was here in the university as a Morehouse student of CIEE in
2001 for the whole school year.
Exactly. So he's a CIEE originally, and we brought him back to come live with us. So we are truly grateful for him. Please, I'd like to say thank you once again. Those of us who have classes, we can go. There's a small something that is going to be passed around here also. So as soon as you're done, you can wait for a few minutes and then they pass out something for you. But if you do have class, please, CIEE students and everybody, if you do have class, thank you very much. You can take a leave of us. Enjoy yourselves. Oh, okay. There's a short announcement here, so please I'll allow for Dr. Albie Walls to give us a little bit of some information.
Just very briefly, thank you. Particularly for those students here, I went to work with the California Study Abroad program upstairs. There's a Pan-African Student Union Summit coming up on the 8th of March. It's a Friday. It probably will take place in this very room. There's a number of student organizations that are coming together trying to bring about this idea of Pan-Africanism, common African identity, whether born outside the continent, on the continent, whatever part of the continent.